A woman sat alone at a restaurant table when three men in expensive suits surrounded her. One blocked the exit. One leaned over her shoulder. One stood directly behind her chair and whispered something that made her hands stop moving. Nobody in that crowded restaurant said a word. Nobody stood up. Nobody moved. Except one man, a tired single father in a faded gray shirt who had promised himself years ago that this part of his life was finished forever. He was wrong. And the three men who picked that restaurant were about to find out exactly how wrong they were. If stories like this one hit differently, the kind where quiet people turn out to be the most dangerous ones in the room, you're in the right place. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to that restaurant. The lunch crowd at Harlan's downtown was the kind that liked to pretend it was sophisticated. White tablecloths, low lighting even at noon, a wine list that cost more than some people's rent. The kind of place where business happened over food, where deals were sealed with handshakes across imported mineral water, where nobody raised their voice because nobody needed to. Power didn't need to be loud in a room like that. Mason Rourke didn't belong there. He knew it the second he pushed through the front door. The hostess, early 20s, practiced smile, had looked at his boots before she looked at his face. His shirt was clean, but it carried the permanent shadow of work that never fully washed out. His hands were rough in a way that no restaurant like Harlan's was accustomed to. He was the kind of man people looked past in places like this. That was fine. He'd spent most of his adult life learning how to be invisible. Two, he said. Of course. She reached for menus without dropping the smile. Right this way. Sadie was already pulling on his hand, trying to look everywhere at once. The chandelier, the white napkins folded into triangles, a waiter carrying something that smelled incredible. She was 7 and still young enough to find everything worth staring at. Mason let her steer him slightly, watching her face instead of where they were going. That was the only pure thing left from the last few years. Watching Sadie discover things. They were given a table near the back, slightly tucked behind a support column. The hostess probably thought she was doing them a favor by hiding them from the better clientele. Mason actually preferred it. Old habits. He ordered water and the cheapest thing on the lunch menu, a club sandwich that still cost $14, and Sadie immediately started arranging her silverware in the wrong order, convinced she knew how it was supposed to go. Fork goes on the left, he said. I know, Dad. I'm making a pattern. A pattern? Yes. She looked up at him with the specific kind of patience only a 7-year-old can manufacture. It's art. Mason looked at the fork, the spoon, and the butter knife she'd arranged in a triangle. That's a weapon, not art. Sadie giggled and went back to rearranging. He leaned back in his chair and let himself breathe for a moment. Just a moment. The recital was at 3 o'clock. They had time. He'd taken the afternoon off from the Kellerman site, a 2-story commercial job out on the east side. And his foreman had given him a look when he said it was for a school thing. Like taking an afternoon for your daughter's recital was something requiring explanation. Mason had just nodded and clocked out. Some things weren't negotiable. He watched Sadie study the menu with the focus of someone reading a legal document, and something tight in his chest loosened a fraction. She had her mother's mouth, her mother's habit of pressing her lips together when she was thinking hard. He noticed it more lately, which was either a good thing or a painful one. He hadn't decided. He was on his second glass of water when the 3 men came in. Mason didn't look at them because they were loud. They weren't. He looked at them because of how they moved. Most people, when they walk into a restaurant, slow down a little. They scan for their table or their party. They check in with the hostess. They adjust to the room. It's a small social behavior, the pause of someone stepping into a shared space. These 3 didn't pause. They knew exactly where they were going. One moved toward the far right side of the dining room. Another drifted casually, too casually, toward the front of the restaurant near the entrance. The third, the one in the center, walked straight toward a table in the middle of the room where a woman was eating alone. Mason's eyes tracked them without moving his head. The woman at the center table was in her early 30s, maybe. Dark hair pulled back. A blazer that fit like it had been tailored, not bought off a rack. She had her laptop open next to her plate and a small stack of printed documents beside it. She was working while she ate the way people do when they're always slightly more behind than they'd like to be. The third man, gray suit, broad through the shoulders, hair that was silver at the temples in a way someone had probably told him looked distinguished, stopped beside her table. The woman looked up. Something passed across her face. It wasn't quite fear, not yet. It was the look people get when they recognize a threat that they'd hoped wouldn't materialize. Recognition mixed with dread. Mason picked up his water glass and watched over the rim. The man in the gray suit said something. Mason was too far away to catch the words, but he watched the woman's posture change. She sat straighter. Her chin came up a degree. Then she looked down at the papers the man slid across the table toward her, and her jaw tightened. "Dad." Sadie was pointing at the bread basket the waiter had just set down. "Can I have the one with seeds?" "Go ahead." "Which one has seeds?" "The round one." She picked it up, inspected it like a scientist, then tore off a corner and chewed it with great ceremony. Mason kept his attention on the center table. The woman, he still didn't know her name, had pushed the papers back. A small gesture, but a firm one. The man in the gray suit didn't pick them up. He left them exactly where they were and said something else. Whatever it was, it made the woman go very still. Mason set down his glass. The man near the front entrance had shifted his position. He was no longer near the hostess stand. He was standing between the main door and the dining room, not blocking it exactly, but positioned in a way that made it harder to reach. The second man, the one who had moved toward the far side of the room, was angled toward the kitchen corridor. Mason had spent too many years reading rooms not to know what this was. They weren't having a conversation. They were boxing her in. "Dad, can I ask you something?" Sadie was looking at her bread with philosophical seriousness. "Ask." "Why is bread better when you're hungry? Like it tastes different." "Because your body needs it." "So the bread is the same, but I'm different." He almost smiled. "That's basically right." She accepted this and tore off another piece. Mason looked at the three men again. The one at the table had leaned slightly forward, a subtle shift in body language that most people wouldn't read as threatening. In a room full of people who were trained to see only what was presented to them at face value, it probably read as a man making a business point. Mason saw the geometry of it, the angle of the man's body, the placement of his hand on the edge of the table, not resting, but holding, pinning the papers in place so the woman would have to reach past him to move them. The woman's hand was flat on the tablecloth. She was staying very still in the way people stay still when they're calculating their options and finding them limited. Mason pulled his napkin from his lap and set it on the table. "Sadie." "Yeah?" "Stay right here. Don't move from this seat." She looked up from the bread. She was a perceptive kid, always had been. She didn't ask why. She just looked toward the center of the room, following his gaze, and then looked back at him. "Dad?" she said quietly. "That lady looks scared." He paused. It always got him, the way she cut straight to the thing. "Yeah," he said. "She does." He stood up. "Bum." He walked toward the table at a pace that was unhurried, not aggressive. He'd learned a long time ago that approach mattered. The way you moved told people things before you opened your mouth. Moving fast told them you were reactive. Moving slow and steady told them you'd already made a decision. He'd made a decision. The man in the gray suit saw him coming when he was about 6 feet away. His eyes moved in that specific way, that quick evaluating sweep, and Mason watched him decide, in the space of 2 seconds, that this was nobody worth worrying about. A construction worker in a faded shirt, tired looking, soft around the purpose, nothing that required attention. Mason had spent years cultivating that exact impression. "Hey," Mason said. He stopped beside the table, not crowding, just present. He glanced at the woman and then back at the gray suit. "I think she's done talking." The gray suit, Conrad, though Mason wouldn't learn the name for another 10 minutes, looked at him the way people look at things they're deciding whether to bother stepping around. "Sir," Conrad said, and his voice had the practiced smoothness of a man who had won most conversations before they started. "This is a private matter. I'd suggest—" "I'm not suggesting anything," Mason said. "I'm telling you, step back from her table." The woman looked at Mason. Her expression had changed. There was something in it, not relief exactly, more like she was rapidly recalculating the situation and hadn't yet landed on what to make of him. Conrad's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. A tell. Mason had watched men hide tells his whole career, poker faces on the other side of interrogation tables, behind wire and sandbags, and the particular smell of dust that stuck in the back of your throat in certain countries. Conrad's tell was small, but it was there. "You have no idea what you're involving yourself in," Conrad said. "You're probably right," Mason said. "Step back anyway." The second man, the one who'd been positioned near the far wall, appeared at Conrad's shoulder, bigger, younger by a decade, the kind of size that got its way in most situations through simple physics. "Time to sit back down," the second man said. His name, Mason would later learn, was Breck. He had the look of someone who'd spent his 20s doing the kind of work that didn't show up on a resume and had learned to mistake physical confidence for actual capability. Mason looked at him, just looked, the same way he'd learned to look at things, flat and complete, cataloging without commentary. "Your call," Mason said. Breck reached for his arm. It lasted maybe 4 seconds. Breck's arm went one direction, Breck went another. The mechanics were precise enough that it looked to anyone watching from a distance almost gentle, like an elaborate handshake that had gone somewhere unexpected. But Breck was on the floor beside the table, arm pinned, face against the carpet, breathing hard through his nose. The dining room went very quiet. Not the silence of surprise, the silence of 40 people simultaneously deciding to become invisible. Conrad stared. The third man near the entrance took 2 steps forward and stopped. Mason straightened up. He hadn't raised his voice once. He hadn't broken a sweat. He looked, if anything, slightly tired, the same expression he'd walked in with. "I asked you to step back," he said to Conrad. Conrad's composure had fractured. Only slightly, but enough. His eyes had changed. The practiced confidence was still there, but underneath it something else was moving, something that looked like recalibration. Like a man who had walked into what he thought was a simple room and realized the geometry was wrong. He looked at Mason the way someone looks at a locked door that suddenly opened on its own. "You don't know what you've done," Conrad said. "Maybe not," Mason said. "But I know what you're not doing, which is standing next to her table." Conrad took 1 step back. Just one. It was technically compliance, and they both knew it. Mason pulled out the empty chair across from the woman and sat down. Not to join her. To block the angle Conrad would need if he tried to reach across the table again. The woman was looking at him with an expression he couldn't entirely read. She was composed, impressively so, given the situation, but there was something in her eyes that was still working through the shock of the last few minutes. "Are you all right?" he asked. She looked at the floor where Breck was being quietly helped to his feet by the third man. She looked at Conrad, who was standing a careful distance back now, his jaw tight and his eyes fixed on Mason with an expression that had moved past indignation into something colder. "I don't know yet," she said. Her voice was steadier than he expected. "But I think that's a better answer than I had 60 seconds ago." "Mason," he said, "I'm sorry about—" He gestured vaguely at the overturned situation around them. "All of this." "Evelyn," she said, someone in the back of the restaurant started crying quietly. A waiter had retreated entirely into the kitchen. The manager was standing by the bar holding his phone with both hands, visibly unsure whether to call someone or continue not calling someone. Conrad looked at the papers still sitting on Evelyn's table. "This doesn't end here, Mr. Mason," Mason said. Conrad stared at him. "This doesn't end here, Mason." Mason looked back at him without heat or drama or anything particularly readable. "Sure," he said. And then, because Breck was back on his feet now, and the third man had moved closer to Conrad, and the geometry of the room had shifted again, because Mason could feel all 3 of them recalculating, could feel them landing on the decision that they hadn't come this far to leave without what they came for. He reached forward and very deliberately turned Evelyn's stack of documents face down on the table. Not for her. Not as a gesture, because he'd been watching the room, and he wanted them to know that he had been. Sadie was still at the table when he looked back across the restaurant. She had stopped eating her bread. She was watching him with the kind of focus that 7-year-olds don't usually sustain for more than a few seconds unless something has caught them completely. He caught her eye. She gave him a small, careful wave. He turned back to Conrad. Outside, past the front windows, a black SUV sat at the curb. It hadn't been there when Mason arrived. He could see the driver, still behind the wheel, engine probably running. And he understood, with the cold clarity of someone who had spent years learning to understand situations like this one, that this had never been about a business conversation. This had been an extraction, and it wasn't over. Conrad Voss did not leave. That was the first thing Mason noticed, and the thing that told him everything he needed to know about how serious this was. A man running a bluff leaves when the bluff gets called. A man with a real objective doesn't go anywhere. He recalibrates. He waits. He looks for the next angle. Conrad took 3 steps back from the table, straightened his jacket with the automatic gesture of a man who maintained appearances the way other people maintained armor, and then stood there with his hands loose at his sides and his eyes fixed on Mason like he was memorizing a face he planned to look up later. Breck was on his feet again. His face had the particular blankness of a man managing humiliation through sheer willpower. He'd rolled his shoulder twice, checking the joint, making sure nothing was torn, and now he stood slightly behind Conrad's left side, not quite looking at Mason, which Mason read as either embarrassment or a very specific kind of controlled anger. Both were problems. Embarrassed men made stupid decisions. Men running on controlled anger made deliberate ones. The third man, the one who'd been stationed near the entrance, hadn't moved. He was still positioned between the main dining room and the front door. Still casual, still technically just a man standing in a restaurant. But his weight had shifted to the balls of his feet, and his right hand had moved to the inside pocket of his jacket and stayed there. Mason tracked all 3 of them without looking directly at any one of them. "The manager's going to call the police," Evelyn said quietly. She was looking at her phone, which was face up on the table. A call log was visible. She'd tried to dial twice in the last few minutes, and both times the signal had shown full bars, but the call hadn't connected. She stared at it a moment. "My phone's not working." "They have a jammer," Mason said. Same volume, same tone, like they were discussing the weather. She looked at him. You can't just, that's illegal." "A lot of things happening right now are illegal." She absorbed that without visible panic, which told him something about her. Some people went white when the frame of normalcy cracked. Some people got operational. Evelyn Carrington was clearly the second kind, even if she hadn't been tested like this before. "What are they actually trying to do?" Mason asked. "They want me to sign over operating authority for the analytics division of my company." She said it flatly, the way you say a thing you've already processed enough to stop being shocked by. "It's worth about $400 million on its own, with the rest of the company attached, significantly more. There are investors, a group I made the mistake of letting close to the board, who've been positioning for this for 18 months. I didn't understand how far they were willing to go until Conrad walked through that door." "You knew him before today." "He's been at 3 board meetings, always polished, always with the right language." Her jaw tightened. "I kept thinking the problem was political, internal, something I could navigate. And then he showed up here." "And then he showed up here," she agreed. Mason looked toward the window. The black SUV was still there. The driver's hands were on the wheel now, which meant the engine was running and someone had given a signal or was waiting for one. There was a second vehicle, so he'd spotted it in the last 2 minutes, a gray sedan parked at the corner, with a driver who was also still behind the wheel. 2 vehicles. 5 men total counting the drivers. This was not a corporate negotiation that had gotten out of hand. This was a planned operation with a planned exit route. Conrad finally spoke. "Mason." He said the name like he was trying it out, like it might mean something he hadn't yet placed. "You intervened in something that doesn't concern you. I understand that from where you're sitting, you saw a woman being pressured and you made a decision. I respect that. I do." He paused, and the pause had the quality of something rehearsed to sound unrehearsed. "But you should understand the scope of what's actually happening here. This is a legal matter, a financial matter. It will be resolved one way or another." "She's not signing anything," Mason said. "That's not really your decision." "No," Mason said. "It's hers, and she's not signing." Conrad looked at Evelyn, then back at Mason. Something shifted in his expression. The polished surface remained, but underneath it, the calculation had changed. "You have a daughter," Conrad said. The temperature in the room changed. Mason didn't move. He didn't speak immediately. He sat with what Conrad had just said, and felt the thing it triggered. A deep cold that started in his sternum and moved outward. Not panic, not rage, something much quieter and more total than either of those things. And then he spoke. "Don't," Mason said, just the one word. Conrad continued anyway, which was the second significant mistake he made that afternoon. 7 years old, I believe. Sadie. She's sitting right over there in the gray dress. He tilted his head slightly in the direction of Sadie's table, a gesture so deliberate it was almost theatrical. She came in with you about 40 minutes ago. You took the afternoon off work for her school event. A pause. It would be unfortunate if the afternoon became complicated. The dining room was so quiet that someone at a nearby table could be heard setting down a fork. Evelyn was looking at Mason. He was looking at Conrad. His voice, when he spoke, was completely level. Not the levelness of someone suppressing something. The levelness of someone who had already moved past the emotional register entirely and arrived somewhere much more practical. "I'm going to say this once," Mason said, "and I need you to hear it clearly. Don't mention my daughter again. Don't look at her. Don't reference her. Not now, not after this is over, not to anyone in whatever organization you're working with. This is not a negotiation. This is me telling you what the line is." Conrad smiled. It was a thin, confident smile. The smile of a man who believed that having leverage meant he controlled the room. "I understand you're upset," he started. "I'm not upset," Mason said. And the strange thing was that he wasn't. That was the part that would have unnerved Conrad if Conrad had been smart enough to read it. Mason wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He had simply crossed into a different mode of operating, one where emotion was a variable he'd already set aside and what remained was pure assessment. Conrad nodded to Breck. Breck moved. He came in from Mason's left side, which was the obvious approach given the table layout, and he led with his right hand reaching for Mason's collar, the grip of someone planning to drag rather than strike, which told Mason he'd been instructed to control rather than hurt. Mason let him get close. Then Breck's weight was committed, and there was a moment, a very brief, very specific moment, where physics stopped being negotiable. What happened next took approximately 6 seconds and covered maybe 4 feet of floor space. Breck's forward momentum became a problem for Breck. His right arm went the wrong direction. His center of gravity dropped below where he needed it. He hit the floor between 2 tables and stayed there, not unconscious but thoroughly oriented toward the carpet and thoroughly unwilling to test what happened if he tried to get up again. A woman at a nearby table stood up so fast she knocked over her chair. Somebody else said something sharp that got swallowed by the general sound of the room rearranging itself. Chairs scraping, someone dropping cutlery, the kitchen door banging open as a cook looked through and then immediately thought better of it. The third man, at the entrance, stepped forward. Mason stood up from the table and turned to face him. "Last chance," Mason said, and there was nothing theatrical about it. It was a logistical statement. The third man stopped. He looked at Breck on the floor. He looked at Mason. He looked at Conrad, who gave him a small shake of the head. Not retreating, just recalibrating. The third man moved back toward the entrance and resumed his position. Conrad stared at Mason with an expression that had completed its journey from irritation through controlled anger and arrived somewhere Mason recognized, genuine reassessment. "Who are you?" Conrad asked. "I told you, Mason." "That's a name, it's not an answer." Mason looked at the black SUV through the window, then at Conrad. "It's enough." A waiter appeared at the edge of the dining room, so young, couldn't have been more than 22, shaking slightly, and said to the room in general, "The manager we've contacted," and then trailed off because it wasn't clear anyone was listening, and even less clear what came after that sentence. Mason glanced at Evelyn. "Can you walk?" "Yes." "Your documents. There's nothing on those papers I would ever sign." She was already gathering her phone and her laptop with efficient movements. "What are you—" "Don't stand up yet," Mason said. She paused, settled back into the chair. Mason looked at the room. The full room. Not just the 3 men, but the sight lines, the exits, the layout he'd been passively cataloging since he sat down. The kitchen corridor on the far left ran through to a service exit. He'd clocked it when the waiter brought water. A reflex so old he barely noticed it anymore. The main entrance was occupied. The corridor to the bathrooms dead-ended. The kitchen was the option, which was also the option Conrad would use if he decided the restaurant was no longer the right place for this conversation. "If they move," Mason said quietly, "they'll go through the kitchen." Evelyn looked at him. How do you know that? Because it's what I do. She studied him for a half second. The frank, quick-reading look of someone who processed information fast and had learned to trust her processing. Who were you? She asked. Not who are you, were. Mason didn't answer that. What he did instead was watch Conrad reach into his jacket pocket and take out his phone. The jammer, wherever it was apparently not affecting Conrad's own equipment. Directional, probably, targeted at the immediate dining area, which meant Conrad was running on a frequency band the jammer excluded, military grade or close to it. Conrad spoke into the phone. Brief. 3 or 4 words Mason couldn't make out from this distance. Outside, the driver of the black SUV opened his door. Okay, Mason said. Stand up. Stay close to me. We're going to the kitchen. The kitchen? I know. Move. Evelyn stood. She tucked her laptop under her arm and left the documents on the table, face down, where Mason had put them, which struck him as a choice rather than an accident. A small declaration. Conrad saw them move and said sharply, Stop. Nobody stopped. Breck. Conrad's voice cracked slightly on the name. Not emotion, but urgency. Breck was getting to his feet, slower this time, one hand on the seat of an overturned chair. Mason kept himself between Evelyn and the room as they moved toward the kitchen door. He heard Conrad's footsteps behind them. Not running, but no longer maintaining the pretense of patience. The third man near the entrance had pivoted and was angling through the dining room, trying to intercept from the left. Mason pushed through the swinging kitchen door. The kitchen was all stainless steel and fluorescent light, and the smell of something burning on a back burner because everyone had stopped paying attention to the stoves. 4 employees were in various positions of stopped motion. A line cook with a spatula still in hand, a dishwasher pressed back against the far counter, a prep worker who'd been mid-task with a knife and had set it down with exaggerated care, a sous chef near the pass who was on his own phone and looked up with an expression that cycled through confusion, recognition of the situation, and the decision to not be involved, all in about 1 second. Service exit, Mason said, to no one in particular, and the sous chef pointed left out of pure reflex. They moved left. Behind them, the kitchen door swung open again. Breck came through first, with the third man, whose name was Decker, Mason would find out later, close behind him. Conrad followed at a measured pace, still composed, still in control of his surface presentation, even as the situation deteriorated. Mason, Conrad's voice carried across the kitchen. There is nowhere this ends well for you. You've assaulted 2 men. You're interfering with a legal business matter. Whatever you think you're accomplishing. A large rolling cart of clean dishes crashed to the floor between them. Not from Mason. From Breck, who'd knocked it trying to move fast in the narrow space between the prep counter and the refrigeration units. The sound was enormous. A sustained metallic crash that bounced off every hard surface in the room and probably carried into the dining room and possibly into the street. The prep worker yelped and pressed further back against the counter. Sorry, Breck said automatically, to no one in particular, and then immediately looked furious at himself for saying it. Mason and Evelyn had reached the far end of the kitchen. A heavy door, the kind with a metal push bar, led to a short corridor. Mason had seen this layout before in commercial kitchens. A buffer space before the actual exterior exit, used for deliveries. There'd be a loading area on the other side. Probably the alley. He pushed through. The corridor was narrow, maybe 8 feet long, with a mop and a collection of flat-broke cardboard boxes stacked against one wall. The exterior door at the far end had a push bar and a small mesh-reinforced window above it. Mason went to the window first. The alley outside was thin, single vehicle width, and it was not empty. He could see the nose of a vehicle at the far left end, which would be the gray sedan he'd spotted on the street. The right end of the alley opened onto what looked like a side street. He heard the kitchen door swing open behind them. Evelyn was breathing steadily. She hadn't spoken in the last 2 minutes. She was watching him with focused attention, tracking what he was doing rather than reacting to it. Okay, he said. When this door opens, we go right. Don't stop. If anyone comes from that direction, stay behind me. You keep saying that, she said. Which part? Stay behind me. Does it bother you? She thought about it for what was genuinely about 1 second. No, she said. Actually, no. He hit the push bar. Cold air. Concrete. The specific smell of restaurant back alleys, grease and dumpster, and something vaguely organic that nobody needed to identify. He stepped out first, checked both directions in the 3 seconds before Evelyn came through behind him, and moved right. They made it approximately 15 feet before the far end of the alley. The right end, the open end, the one he'd chosen because the gray sedan was on the left, produced a man, not a driver. A fourth person, standing at the mouth of the alley with his jacket open and his hands visible, positioned in the precise way of someone who'd been waiting. Mason stopped. Evelyn stopped behind him. The man at the end of the alley didn't move. He was just there, which was message enough. Behind them, the corridor door opened and Conrad stepped out into the alley. Breck and Decker behind him. 3 men from the back. 1 man blocking the exit ahead. 4 men. 1 alley. No angles. Mason hadn't already seen. Conrad walked toward them, unhurried now. The SUV driver was at the far left end. Mason could hear a car door and the particular sound of someone walking on concrete trying not to make noise. 5 men total, then, all converging. Conrad stopped about 10 feet away. "I want to be reasonable," he said. And the strange thing was that he sounded like he meant it, or had convinced himself he meant it, which functioned identically. "Ms. Carrington, this doesn't need to be more difficult than it already is. You sign the documents, you retain your position, you keep the company. The division transfers and you move forward. Everyone's interests are protected." "You brought 5 men to a restaurant to protect everyone's interests," Evelyn said. "I brought 5 men because I knew you wouldn't listen otherwise. That's not how legal business works." "No," Conrad said, and something in his composure slipped slightly, just enough to let something harder show through underneath. "It's how real business works." Mason was not listening to the conversation. He was counting steps. He was noting which of the 4 men was standing on uneven footing. The alley surface was cracked, buckled in one spot near the dumpster, and which ones were watching him rather than watching Evelyn. Breck was watching him. Decker was watching Evelyn. The driver at the left end of the alley was watching Conrad for instruction. The 4th man blocking the right exit was watching the space between Mason and Conrad like he was waiting for a specific signal. Conrad's phone buzzed. He glanced at it. His expression changed, not dramatically, a small tightening around the eyes, a recalibration he tried to suppress and mostly succeeded. "Mr. Mason," he said. He dropped the first name only. "I've just been informed that the police response time to this area is currently about 12 minutes. We have time to resolve this before it becomes more complicated for everyone." A pause. "I've also been informed of some other things." He looked at Mason differently now, not with the dismissive assessment of the dining room, not with irritated recalibration, with something that was pulling toward the edges of recognition, the way you look at something you've seen before but can't quite place, the indexing happening in real time. "Mason Rourke," Conrad said slowly. Mason said nothing. "That's your full name." Conrad said it without the question mark of someone guessing. He said it like someone reading from a document they'd just been handed. "Mason Rourke, 37 years old, construction electrician, currently employed at Kellerman Building Services. Previously," he paused, and the pause had a new quality to it. "Previously, something else." Breck shifted his weight behind Conrad. The 4th man at the exit end of the alley had gone very still. Conrad looked up from his phone. "You were Naval Special Warfare," he said. The alley was quiet enough that the street sounds from the far end seemed distant and unrelated, like noise from a different world. 12 minutes, Mason said. "You said 12 minutes for police." He looked at Conrad with the same flat, complete attention he'd looked at everything all afternoon. "That's longer than you need and shorter than you think." Conrad's confident expression held for 3 more seconds. Then, for the first time since he'd walked into Harlan's, Conrad Voss looked at Mason Rourke the way you look at something you're genuinely not sure you can move. "Breck," Conrad said quietly. Breck lunged. And the alley behind Harlan's restaurant, which had spent decades being nothing more than a place where kitchen staff took cigarette breaks and delivery drivers argued about parking, became something else entirely for the next 90 seconds. Mason moved. Not toward Breck. That was the expected direction. He moved left and past him, angling toward the second man, Decker, who was still focused on Evelyn, which was the wrong place to be focused when Mason was in motion. Decker turned too late. He had good instincts, but they registered about a half-second behind what was needed, and a half-second was an enormous amount of time. Breck, having committed to his lunge and found nothing there, crashed into the dumpster. Decker went down in 2 movements, controlled, deliberate, nothing broken, but he stayed down. The driver at the left end had started moving. He was bigger than the others and faster than he looked, and Mason redirected rather than absorbed, which put the driver into the brick wall on the left side of the alley with enough force to settle the question. 3 down. Conrad stood in the center of the alley. The 4th man at the exit, the one who'd been waiting, took 2 steps in and then stopped. He looked at what was around him on the alley floor. He looked at Mason. He put his hands up. Not dramatically, just up. The universal signal of a man who had completed a rapid cost-benefit analysis. Conrad looked at the 4th man, then at Mason, then at the alley floor. He straightened his jacket. It was an absurd gesture given the circumstances, but Mason understood it. It was the only thing Conrad still controlled, so he controlled it. "This isn't finished," Conrad said. "I know," Mason said. He turned back to Evelyn. She was standing exactly where he'd told her to stand. She hadn't moved. She was looking at the alley around her. The 3 men on the ground, the 4th with his hands raised, Conrad in the middle of it all, looking like a man watching his certainties unravel thread by thread. And her face held an expression that Mason couldn't immediately categorize. Not shock. She was past shock. Not relief either. Not yet. Something between awe and recalibration. The look of someone updating their understanding of what was possible. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head. "Good." He looked toward the street end of the alley. "The police will be here soon. We should be visible when they arrive." "Yes," she said. And then, because she was that kind of person, "Who trained you?" Mason picked up Conrad's phone, which had fallen to the alley floor when Conrad flinched and looked at the screen. The text that had come in was still visible. A name. A location. Numbers that looked like they were from a financial transaction. He handed it to Evelyn without comment. She read it. Her face changed in a different way. Not fear this time. Recognition. The specific, cold recognition of someone seeing proof of a thing they'd suspected but hadn't been able to confirm. "This is one of my board members," she said. "I know," Mason said. He didn't know, actually, but it fit. She looked at him. "U.S. Navy," he said finally, answering the question she'd asked 30 seconds ago. Long time ago. From somewhere in the building behind them, they could hear the kitchen staff talking loudly and the distant sound of the front door of Harlan's opening repeatedly. The dining room finally was emptying. People were leaving in the practical, slightly embarrassed way they always left situations they'd watched without intervening. And from the far end of the street, faint but getting closer, the particular sound of sirens. Breck made a sound on the alley floor that might have been an attempt to get up. Mason glanced at him. Breck decided against it. Conrad stood in the center of the alley and looked at the phone in Evelyn's hand with an expression that had passed through anger and was settling into something grimmer. "Whatever you think that proves," he started. "It proves enough," Evelyn said. Her voice was completely steady. "It proves more than enough." Mason looked toward the mouth of the alley where the sirens were now less than a block away, close enough that the lights were starting to paint the buildings in alternating red and white. He thought about Sadie. He thought about the recital that started in less than an hour, about the gray dress she was wearing today because she'd insisted it was her recital dress, even though it had a small stain near the hem from a painting project 2 weeks ago. He thought about how he'd promised her, specifically this morning over cereal, that he would be there. He looked at Conrad. He looked at Evelyn. He looked at the alley that had become, in the space of an afternoon, the center of something much larger than a lunch. The first police cruiser turned into the alley entrance. Mason put his hands where they could be seen and waited. The first officer out of the cruiser was young enough that Mason could see the effort it took him to project authority into a situation he didn't yet understand. He had his hand on his belt, not drawing, just resting there, the way they trained you to when you weren't sure what you were walking into. His partner, older, came around the passenger side and took one look at the alley and reached for his radio. Mason kept his hands visible and did not move. "Sir?" The young officer started. "My name is Mason Rourke," Mason said. Flat, clear. The voice he used when he needed to be heard without triggering anything. "I intervened in what I believe was an attempted abduction. The woman behind me is Evelyn Carrington. These men came into the restaurant where we were having lunch and attempted to coerce her into signing documents under duress. When she refused, they attempted to physically remove her from the premises." The officer looked at the four men in various states of horizontal and vertical distress around the alley. He looked at Conrad, who was the only one still standing, still in his expensive suit, still maintaining the surface of a man who had this under control. Conrad spoke first. Of course he did. "Officer, my name is Conrad Voss. I'm the Senior Director of Acquisitions at Belmore Capital Partners. What you're seeing here is the result of an unprovoked physical assault by this man." He gestured toward Mason. "We were engaged in a lawful business negotiation with Ms. Carrington. This individual inserted himself without provocation and attacked my associates." The older officer came forward, radio still in hand. "Ma'am, are you all right?" "I'm not injured," Evelyn said, "but I want to be very clear. These men surrounded me inside the restaurant, blocked the exits, jammed cell signals to prevent me from calling for help, and when I refused to sign documents, they attempted to take me through the kitchen exit to a waiting vehicle outside." "That is a fabrication," Conrad started. "I have the phone," Evelyn said. She held up Conrad's phone, the one Mason had recovered from the alley floor, and handed to her. "This device has communications on it that I believe are relevant to what happened this afternoon. I'm asking that it be secured as evidence." Conrad's jaw moved. Not words, just the jaw. The older officer looked at the phone, then at Conrad. "Sir, I'm going to need everyone to stay where they are." More cruisers arrived in the next 4 minutes, 3 of them, which meant someone inside the restaurant had eventually managed to get a call through, probably once the jammer's range had been exceeded by enough distance. With them came 2 plainclothes detectives who had the look of people who'd been pulled from something else and hadn't yet decided whether to be annoyed about it. The alley became a scene in the procedural sense. Yellow tape, eventually, a forensics officer who photographed Conrad's phone before bagging it, a paramedic who looked at Breck's shoulder and pronounced it strained rather than separated and moved on. Statements were taken, first informally, and then with notebooks, and then with the particular patience of detectives who'd heard versions of everything and were interested in the version where the stories didn't match. Mason gave his statement standing against the alley wall, hands in his pockets now, speaking in the same level tone he used for everything. One of the detectives, a woman in her 40s named Okafor, with reading glasses pushed up onto her forehead, took his statement herself rather than delegating it. He noticed that. He also noticed that she asked him twice about his background without asking directly, phrasing it as questions about his training, his assessment of the situation, how he'd made certain decisions. She was good. He answered without elaboration. "You assessed that they were planning to physically remove her from the restaurant," Okafor said. "Not just pressure her." "Yes." "What specifically told you that?" "The positioning. 3 men, 3 points of the room, one on the exit, one covering the kitchen corridor, one engaging her directly. That's not how you run a hard sell negotiation. That's how you run a controlled movement." He paused. The vehicles outside confirmed it. 2 drivers, engines running. They were planning to go somewhere after the restaurant. Okafor wrote something. "And you have experience reading tactical positioning." "I have some experience, yes." She looked up at him over the notepad. "Military?" "Previously." She held his gaze for a moment and then wrote something else. Evelyn gave her statement to the second detective, a man named Brower, who had the methodical quality of someone who trusted process over instinct and was probably right to, and Mason watched her from across the alley. She was precise. She had dates, she had names, she had context that went back 18 months to the first board meeting where she'd noticed Belmore Capital's interest shifting from investment to acquisition. She'd been building a file in her own head, he realized. She'd seen this coming, or something like it, and she'd been logging details without knowing exactly what she was logging them for. The phone was going to matter. Mason had known that from the moment he picked it up, which was why he'd handed it to Evelyn rather than the police directly. She needed to see what was on it first. She needed that fraction of a second to understand what she was holding, because understanding it meant she could contextualize it for the investigation, rather than letting the investigation contextualize it without her. People who spent their lives building companies understood leverage. Evelyn understood leverage. It took 40 minutes for the alley to move from chaos to procedure, and during those 40 minutes, Mason thought about Sadie's recital with a specific, grinding persistence that he couldn't turn off. The recital was at 3. It was now 2:47. The school was 11 minutes from here on a normal day. Today was not a normal day. I excused himself from the second round of questions. Okafor had been replaced by a junior officer who was asking the same questions with less precision, and walked to where Sadie was standing just outside the tape with a restaurant employee who'd been designated as the child watcher, and looked like she had not signed up for this level of responsibility. Sadie had his jacket. She'd taken it from his chair in the restaurant at some point. He noticed she was wearing it over her gray dress, too large by about 3 sizes, the sleeves hanging past her hands. She was watching the alley with the focused, unflappable attention of a child who has decided that understanding something is better than being frightened of it. "Hey," he said. "Hi." She looked at him. "Are you in trouble?" "A little, not the kind that lasts." She processed this. "Did you hurt those men?" He crouched down to her level. "I made sure they stopped doing something that was hurting someone else. A couple of them got knocked around in the process. Nobody's seriously hurt." "That lady?" "She's okay." Sadie nodded slowly. She had a bread roll in her hand. Somebody had given it to her from the restaurant, apparently, and she'd kept it through all of this, and she tore a small piece and ate it while thinking. "Dad," she said, "the recital." "I know. It starts at 3. "I know, Sadie." "My solo is at 3:22. Of course, she knew the exact minute. She'd been talking about 3:22 for a week. "I know," he said. "I'm working on it." She looked at him with a kind of tired patience that shouldn't have existed in a 7-year-old, but had been there since she was about 5, like she'd arrived in the world already practiced in the particular kind of patience required for dealing with situations beyond her control. "Okay," she said. "Just that." He stood up and went to find Detective Okafor. She let him go at 3:04, with the understanding that he'd come into the station tomorrow morning for a full formal statement, and with the specific caveat, delivered in the tone of someone who was extending a courtesy and wanted him to know it, that she would need to understand significantly more about his background before this was closed. "Tomorrow morning," Mason confirmed. 9 o'clock, Okafor said. He got Sadie into the truck, his truck, which was parked 2 blocks away and had a cracked rearview mirror and $40 worth of loose change in the cup holder because he kept meaning to take it to the bank and never did. And they made it to the school at 3:17, 5 minutes before the solo. He sat in the 4th row because the front was full and he was 5 minutes late. He watched Sadie walk out onto that small stage in her gray dress with the stain near the hem, and her hair slightly disheveled from wearing his oversized jacket for the better part of an hour. And he watched her find him in the audience with the automatic searching look that kids do. And he watched her face when she found him. She stood up straighter. She performed with the slightly too serious expression of a 7-year-old trying very hard, which was the best possible expression anyone could perform with. And when she finished, she looked at him immediately. He gave her a thumbs up. She almost smiled but held it together until she was back in line with the other kids, at which point she allowed herself a small, private grin directed at her shoes. Mason sat in the folding chair in the school auditorium with his hands on his knees and the accumulated weight of the afternoon settling over him like something physical. And for the first time since he'd stood up from his table at Harlan's, he let himself just breathe. It was not, as it turned out, a good long-term strategy. The breathing part. Because the thing about a day like this one, the thing Mason had spent years learning and then years trying to unlearn, was that it didn't stay in its lane. It opened doors he'd gotten very good at keeping closed. 3 days after the incident at Harlan's, the local news ran a story. Then a regional outlet picked it up. By the end of the first week, it had the shape of the kind of thing that went wider. A female CEO, an attempted corporate abduction, a mysterious former military man who'd intervened and then walked away before the cameras arrived. Mason had walked away specifically to avoid the cameras. He'd done a reasonable job of it given the circumstances, but Okafor had not volunteered his name to the press, which he respected, and the restaurant staff had given a description, tall, faded gray shirt, construction boots, that fit approximately 30,000 men in the metro area. He went to work. He drove Sadie to school. He picked her up. He made dinners that were functional rather than impressive. Pasta from a box, chicken that he'd learned to season adequately if not brilliantly, grilled cheese on the nights when neither of them had the energy for something with more steps. The formal statement at the police station took 3 hours. Okafor was methodical, and she was fair, and she asked, at one point, whether he was concerned about Conrad Voss retaliating. Conrad Voss is going to have enough to deal with, Mason said. What makes you say that? The phone. Whatever was on that phone. Okafor studied him. We can't discuss an active investigation. I know. I'm not asking you to. She looked at him for a moment longer. You're not worried. I'm always worried, he said. I just don't find it useful. She made a sound that might have been the leading edge of a laugh. She wrote something. What was on the phone, as it turned out, was significantly more than a text from a board member. Mason learned this not from Okafor, but from Evelyn, who called him 11 days after the restaurant because she'd gotten his number from the police report, a detail she admitted with a directness that suggested she wasn't particularly apologetic about it, and because she said she owed him information he deserved to have. He was on his lunch break at the Kellerman site when she called, sitting on the tailgate of the work truck eating a sandwich he'd made that morning, which was better than it sounded because he'd finally figured out the right mustard to everything else ratio. Mr. Rourke, she said. Mason, he said. Mr. Rourke sounds like I'm being called to the principal's office. A brief pause. Mason, I want to tell you what we found. What they found. What Evelyn's legal team, working in coordination with the Financial Crimes Division that Okafor had apparently looped in within 48 hours of the incident, was not simply a text from a board member. The phone contained an encrypted messaging thread going back 7 months. It documented, in the particular shorthand of people who believed their communications were secure, the full arc of what Belmore Capital had been planning. The acquisition of Evelyn's analytics division wasn't the end goal. The division was the entry point. Once control was established there, the remaining company structure became vulnerable to a series of financial maneuvers that would have effectively dissolved Carrington Tech as an independent entity within 18 months, distributing its assets to a set of shell holdings that connected, at several removes, back to 2 members of Evelyn's own board. People she'd worked with for years. People who'd sat across tables from her, eaten at the same restaurants, attended the same industry events, and spent 7 months helping dismantle the company she'd spent a decade building. Howard Briggs, she said, and Patricia Lennox. Mason didn't recognize the names. He didn't need to. How are you doing with that? He asked. Another pause, longer this time. Honestly? If you want. I'm doing badly with it, she said. I've worked with Howard for 6 years. I trusted Patricia's judgment on 3 major decisions that shaped where the company is now. And the whole time, she stopped. The whole time they were... Another stop. I keep thinking I should have seen it. I keep running back through every meeting, every conversation, looking for the thing I missed. You won't find it, Mason said. What do you mean? I mean that people who are good at that kind of long-term deception don't leave things to find. They know you'll look, so there's nothing there. You couldn't have seen it because there was nothing to see. A silence on the line. That's either the most comforting thing you could have said or the most terrifying, she said. Probably both. He heard her exhale. Conrad's been charged, Breck and Decker as well, the drivers. Briggs and Lennox have been removed from the board pending investigation. The filing was this morning. A pause. I wanted you to know. I also wanted to say something that I've been trying to figure out how to say for 11 days. You don't... I do, she said. You stood up in that restaurant when no one else was going to. And I've been thinking about that for 11 days. Not just the physical part of it, the capability, whatever. I've been thinking about the decision. Because you sat there with your daughter and you watched something happen and you made a choice to be involved when it would have been completely reasonable not to be. Mason looked at his sandwich. He'd been about to take another bite. He set it down on the tailgate. My daughter pointed it out first, he said. What? She said the lady looked scared. I don't know if I would have moved as fast without that. You would have moved. Maybe. You would have, Evelyn said. I watched your face in that restaurant before you stood up. You'd already made the decision. She just said out loud what you were already thinking. He didn't argue the point. He wasn't sure she was wrong. What happens to the company now? He asked. We rebuild the board with people I should have had from the beginning. The analytics division stays. We bring in outside auditors to make sure there's nothing else buried in the financials, and then we move forward. She said it the way people say things they've decided on as a matter of survival, not enthusiasm. We move forward because that's the only direction available. That sounds right? Mason. She paused. I'd like to meet. Not about anything formal. I just think there are things it would be better to say in person. He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which meant acknowledging that he'd been thinking about this conversation for 11 days also, just from a different angle. I can do Thursday, he said. After 3:30. I pick up Sadie at 3. After 3:30, she said. I'll find somewhere that isn't Harlan's. He made a sound that was mostly exhale. Good call. They met at a coffee place that had been there since the 70s and looked it. Worn wooden booths, coffee served in ceramic mugs, a menu written on a chalkboard that probably hadn't changed significantly in a decade. Evelyn was already there when he arrived, which meant she'd gotten there early, which told him something about her. She looked different than she had in the alley. Not composed in a performance sense, she'd been composed in the alley too, impressively so, but less compressed. Less like someone managing a situation at all times. She'd pushed her sleeves up, and she had a coffee already, and she was reading something on her phone with the focused distraction of someone who can't fully turn it off, which he recognized because he had his own version of that. She looked up when he came in. Sadie's at her grandmother's? She asked when he sat down. Her grandmother is my neighbor, Mrs. Kowalski. She's 74 and she cheats at cards, and Sadie thinks she's the most interesting person alive. Evelyn almost smiled. Good childcare is hard to find. She makes it work by being genuinely interesting. A waiter came by. Not a waiter, actually. The owner, who'd been there since the place opened and seemed to operate on the principle that restaurants were primarily social spaces where food was incidental. And Mason ordered a coffee, and they sat for a moment without the pressure of the conversation that was coming. It was Evelyn who moved them there. I want to understand something about you, she said. You don't have to answer, but I've been building a picture of the afternoon, and there are things that don't add up if I'm assuming you're just a construction worker who happened to be in the right place. I'm not just anything, Mason said, but I am actually a construction electrician. You were Naval Special Warfare. I was. For how long? 11 years. She held her coffee mug in both hands. And then you stopped. And then I stopped. She waited. Not pushing, not filling the silence. She was good at waiting, which was a skill more people thought they had than actually did. My wife died, Mason said. He said it the way he always said it, directly, without softening, because softening it had always seemed dishonest in a way he couldn't get past. Not in a dramatic way. Aneurysm. She was 31. We'd been back stateside for 8 months. Sadie was 2. He picked up his coffee. The command offered leave. Eventually they offered a desk assignment. I took the leave and then I didn't go back. You chose Sadie. There wasn't a choice involved, he said. Not really. It just became what was true. Sadie needed a parent, and I was the parent that was still there. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I lost someone too, she said. Not the same. My business partner early on. He pushed me to start the company. He believed in it before I fully believed in it myself. He died before it became what it is. She paused. Became what it was. I keep saying is. I'm still adjusting. The company's still standing, Mason said. Thanks to you. Thanks to you mostly. You'd been building a file in your head for 18 months. You gave that detective everything she needed inside the first 20 minutes. You handed me the phone. You knew what it meant when I handed it to you. They sat with that for a moment. The coffee place had 3 other tables occupied. A man in the corner was reading a physical newspaper, which Mason found genuinely comforting in a way he couldn't fully explain. 2 women were talking at the table nearest the window. Quietly, seriously, the way women talk when something important is being figured out between them. The chalkboard menu had a soup special that was the same soup special as last Thursday, which he knew because he'd been here last Thursday for the same reason he came most Thursdays, which was that it was close to Sadie's school and they had acceptable pie. I want to offer you something, Evelyn said. You already tried that, in the alley. That was money. This is different. She set down her mug. I'm rebuilding the security structure for the company. Not just because of what happened, because what happened revealed that we had almost no real security architecture. Conrad got close enough to pull this off, because the systems I had were designed to protect against external threats, not internal ones. I need someone who can think about both simultaneously. Mason looked at her. I'm a construction electrician. You're a man who read a room well enough to understand an extraction was being planned while having lunch with his 7-year-old daughter, she said. And then you dismantled it. A pause. I've talked to people about what a head of corporate security actually needs. The background, the assessment capability, the ability to understand human threat rather than just infrastructure threat. What you have is, it's not something I can hire easily. Evelyn, I know you're going to say no. I'm going to say no. She nodded. Not surprised. Not performing acceptance, actually not surprised. Tell me why. Because I've spent 2 years building something resembling a stable life for my daughter. I work consistent hours at a job where I know exactly when I'm going to be home. I've been late to 2 things in 2 years, and one of them was a dentist appointment, and one of them was almost Sadie's recital today because of your restaurant. He said it without heat. What you're describing is a job that doesn't have consistent hours. It could. Corporate security doesn't have consistent hours. That's not me being difficult. That's how that job works. Evelyn was quiet. She looked at her mug and then out the window at the street, and then back at him. You're right, she said. He hadn't expected that. Most people negotiated back. Most people had a counter. You're right, she said again. I was offering you the job I need filled without thinking about whether it was actually something you could take. That was not fair. She paused. Let me think about this differently. You don't need to. I want to, she said, because I think there's actually something here, not necessarily the thing I described. Something different. She looked at him directly. Did I have a few weeks to think about it differently? He thought about it. About what it meant to say yes to a version of something he'd said no to. A few weeks, he said. She nodded. Outside, it had started to rain, but the thin, persistent kind that didn't make a dramatic sound on the window, but coated everything in a gray light that softened the edges of things. The man with the newspaper turned a page. The 2 women near the window finished their conversation, and one of them laughed, sudden and genuine, the kind of laugh that happens when something is funnier than expected. Mason wrapped his hands around his coffee mug. He thought about Conrad in that alley, finally saying his name. The way recognition had moved through Conrad's face, not the top layer but the layer underneath, where the actual assessment lived. Mason Rourke, Naval Special Warfare, said with the particular tone of someone who had pulled a file and didn't like what they'd found in it. He thought about how it had felt to hear that. How something had moved in him. Not pride, nothing that clean. More complicated. More like standing at a threshold to a room you'd sealed off and finding that the door still opened. He hadn't wanted it to feel like anything. He'd have preferred it to be entirely neutral. A fact about his past with no present tense. It wasn't entirely neutral. He finished his coffee. Thursday works for me generally, he said, if that's a useful day for thinking about it differently conversations. Evelyn looked at him. Thursday works, she said. The rain had thickened outside. Not enough to be trouble, but enough to make the coffee place feel warmer than its actual temperature. The owner came by without being asked and refilled both their mugs, and neither of them had asked him to stop, which was the quiet agreement people reach in places like this when no one is in a hurry to leave. Mason thought about Sadie at Mrs. Kowalski's, probably being taught card tricks of questionable ethical content, probably eating something that didn't belong in the hour before dinner, probably perfectly happy. He thought about Conrad's face in the alley when he'd looked up and seen Mason already positioned where he hadn't expected anyone to be. The specific expression of a man arriving somewhere and finding that someone had gotten there first. He hadn't lost that. Whatever else the years had changed, he hadn't lost that. He wasn't sure yet what to do with the fact that he hadn't. But Thursday was a few days away, and the coffee was decent, and outside the rain was doing the thing rain does when it settles in for the evening. Becoming less an event and more a condition, steady and present and not going anywhere soon, the kind you adjust to rather than wait out. He adjusted. The Thursdays became a thing, not a scheduled thing, not at first, more like a natural accumulation. the way certain habits form without anyone deciding to form them, through the simple repetition of something being useful enough to repeat. They met at the same coffee place because neither of them suggested changing it, and the owner had started recognizing them both, which meant the refills came without asking and the corner booth was left open until 4:15 on the assumption they'd want it. Mason noticed this approximately the third Thursday in and said nothing about it. Evelyn apparently noticed it around the same time because she tipped generously and always said the owner's name, which was Gerald, and Gerald had the look of a man who appreciated being seen. They talked around the offer for 2 full weeks before Evelyn stopped talking around it and put something specific on the table. "What if the job wasn't a corporate security job?" she said. It was the second Thursday of October, raining again. It rained a lot that month, the kind of sustained autumn gray that settled over the city like a mood, and she'd come from back-to-back board meetings with the replacement directors and looked like someone who'd been reasonable at people for 8 consecutive hours and was running on the last reserves of it. What if it was something that doesn't exist yet? Mason had his coffee. "You're going to have to say more than that. I've been thinking about what you said, about consistent hours, about knowing when you're going to be home." She turned her mug in a slow circle on the table, a thinking gesture, he'd learned. "And I've been thinking about what I actually need versus what I said I needed when I first offered you the job. Those aren't the same thing. What do you actually need?" "I need someone who can build a security culture inside the company, not just protocols and systems. Anyone can hire a firm for that. I need someone who can train people to think about risk the way you think about it, to read rooms, to notice things before they become problems, to understand that the threat that put my company at risk didn't come through a firewall or a locked door. It came through trust, through people I believed in." She paused. "I need someone who understands human threat, the kind that wears a suit and sits at your table and smiles." Mason considered that. That's a training function. Partly. It's also assessment, ongoing evaluation of internal vulnerabilities, building relationships with the security staff we already have, and upgrading their capability. She stopped turning the mug. "And it can be structured with fixed hours. 8 to 4, Monday through Friday. Nothing that takes you away from Sadie's schedule. If there's something that requires more, I'd want your input before it became a requirement, not after." "That's not how security works," he said. "You said I was right about that." "You were right about traditional corporate security? I'm not offering you traditional corporate security. I'm offering you something I'd have to build around whoever took it, which means I can build it around your constraints rather than asking you to fit constraints that were designed for someone else." He looked at her. She looked back. "It's not a favor," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm not offering this because I owe you something for what happened at the restaurant. I'm offering it because you're the right person for what I actually need, and the fact that the structure needs to be custom-built is a design problem, not a charity problem." "You've been thinking about this for 2 weeks, Mason said. "I've been thinking about this since the alley," she said. 2 weeks ago I started thinking about it in a way that led somewhere." He set down his coffee. He looked at the rain on the window. He thought about the Kellerman site, where he'd been working for 14 months, and where the foreman was decent, and the work was honest, and where nothing particularly good or bad was happening, and nothing particularly good or bad was likely to happen. He thought about what it felt like to have been useful in a real way. Not construction useful, which was its own legitimate thing, but the specific usefulness of a skill set being applied to an actual problem. He'd felt it in that alley in a way he hadn't felt it in years, and the feeling had been uncomfortable and also undeniable, and he'd been doing his best to be honest with himself about both of those things. "Sadie doesn't know the specifics of what happened," he said. "She knows I helped someone. She doesn't know the full picture. That's your call to make, not mine. I'd want to talk to her before I agreed to anything, not explain everything, just gauge where she is." Evelyn nodded. "That's a reasonable thing to do." "She's 7. 7-year-olds have opinions." "She has more opinions than most adults I know." The corner of Evelyn's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. The preliminary infrastructure of one. "Talk to her," she said. "Take the time you need. I'm not going anywhere." He talked to Sadie that evening, after dinner, when the dishes were done and Sadie was at the kitchen table doing homework. Second-grade homework, which involved more creativity and less mathematics than Mason remembered from his own second grade, a fact he found simultaneously reassuring and slightly baffling. She was drawing a map of an imaginary country for a geography unit that appeared to have suspended the requirement for imaginary countries to follow actual geographic logic. This mountain range is in the middle of the ocean, he said, looking over her shoulder. It's a volcanic archipelago, she said without looking up. I explained that. To who? To myself. In the planning stage. She added a label in careful second-grade handwriting. Dad, you have something to say. How do you know? Because you did the dishes slowly. She looked up. You do the dishes fast when everything is normal and slow when you're thinking about something. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I've been offered a job. She put down her pencil. Full attention, which with Sadie meant slightly narrowed eyes and the slight forward lean of someone genuinely engaging. A different job from the electrical job? Yes. Does it pay more? Yes. She nodded, taking this in. Is it dangerous? He thought about how to answer that honestly without alarming her. It's a job where I help a company be safer, so it involves thinking about danger, but not usually being in it. Usually, she said. Usually. Is it for the lady from the restaurant? He paused. Yes. Map. She drew a small harbor on the western coast of the archipelago with the focused precision of someone solving a logistical problem. Then she put the pencil down again. Dad, she said, do you miss it? Miss what? She gave him the look. The one that was her mother's look. The one that said, don't make me be more specific about the thing we both know I'm being specific about. The things you used to do, she said, before me. He was quiet for a moment. He owed her an honest answer, and he took the time to find one. Sometimes, he said, not the being away from home part, not the parts that were hard in ways I don't need to put on you, but the being useful part. The feeling that what you're doing matters to something bigger than the task in front of you. He paused. Yeah, sometimes. Sadie looked at her map. Mrs. Kowalski says people are like ships, she said. She says ships that stay in the harbor are safe, but that's not what ships are for. Mrs. Kowalski cheats at cards and philosophizes too much. She says those two things are connected. Sadie looked up. I think you should take the job, Dad. If you can still pick me up at 3. 3 o'clock is non-negotiable. Then I think you should take it. She picked up her pencil again. Can I name my country something with a Q in it? Mrs. Peterson says it's hard to have a Q without a U after it, but I think that's limiting. Mason looked at his daughter. Name it whatever you want, he said. He called Evelyn the next morning, before work, standing in the parking lot of the Kellerman site with the autumn light coming in sideways and a thermos of coffee that had gone slightly lukewarm during the drive. I have conditions, he said. Tell me the conditions, she said. 3 o'clock is an absolute, every day. No exceptions that don't involve a genuine emergency, and we agree on what constitutes genuine before I start. Agreed. If something requires extended hours or travel, I need a minimum of a week's notice unless we're talking about an actual crisis. Routine extended hours is not an acceptable pattern. Agreed. I want to build the training program my way. You can give me the objectives. I'll design the approach. I'm not running someone else's curriculum. That was already my intention, she said. I wasn't planning to hand you a manual. He looked at the site. The foreman was arriving. A good man, a fair man, someone who'd been reasonably decent to work for. He'd have to give 2 weeks' notice. The foreman would take it fine. I'm going to need to understand the full internal structure of the company before I can assess anything, Mason said. Not the org chart, the real structure. Who actually has influence, who makes decisions that aren't on paper, where the relationships are that the diagram doesn't show. That's going to require some uncomfortable conversations, Evelyn said. Probably. I'll set them up. One more thing, he said. Go ahead. I'm not very good at working for people who need managing. He said it plainly, without apology. I've had commanding officers I respected, and I've had ones I would have traded for a decent topographic map. The difference was whether they said what they meant and meant what they said. I'll work well for you if you're direct with me. If something's not working, tell me. Don't navigate around it. A pause on the line. I had someone tell me once that I was too direct, Evelyn said, that I needed to work on my collaborative communication style. Who told you that? Howard Briggs. Mason made a sound that was the closest he came to laughing when he wasn't expecting to. Then I think we'll be fine. He gave his notice at Kellerman that afternoon. The foreman, whose name was Pete and who had the permanent expression of a man carrying more than he let on, took it without dramatics. He asked if it was more money. Mason said yes. Pete said good, that Mason had been undercompensated for what he brought, which was more generous than Mason had expected and which he didn't quite know how to respond to, so he just nodded, and they finished the shift, and that was that. He started at Carrington Tech on the first Monday of November. The building was the kind of modern office architecture that always felt slightly impractical to Mason. Too much glass, too many open spaces designed for a collaborative ideal that bumped up against human beings' actual need for walls. The lobby had a security desk with 2 guards who checked badges with the careful attention of men who'd been told to be thorough without being given a clear reason why thoroughness mattered, which was most of the problem with security culture in places like this. Rules without context, procedures without understanding. He shook both their hands on the first morning and asked their names, which apparently had not happened before, or at least not recently enough to be expected. The older guard, a man named Terrence who'd been there 9 years and had the watchful economy of motion of someone who'd done a lot of observing in a lot of rooms, gave Mason a long look and said, "You're the new security head." "That's me." "They said you were coming." "What did they say?" Terrence considered this with the care of a man who chose his words. "They said you were different." "From what?" "From the last 2. Mason found out over the next week that the last 2 heads of security had been, respectively, a former insurance investigator who'd treated the role as primarily administrative and a retired local police captain who'd spent most of his tenure building a relationship with management and almost none of it building relationships with the actual security staff. The team he inherited was competent in the way that people become competent when they're left alone to figure things out. Functional, reliable, operating on instinct and habit rather than any shared framework. He spent the first 2 weeks not changing anything. He walked the building. He sat in the security office during different shifts. He had coffee with Terrence and with the 3 other guards on rotation and with the 2 IT security specialists whose job theoretically overlapped with his and who had been operating in complete isolation from the physical security team. He talked to department heads, not about security, just about how they worked, what their days looked like, where the pressure points were. He listened more than he spoke, which made some people uncomfortable and others visibly relieved. Evelyn checked in on the second Friday. "How's it going?" she asked. They were in her office, which was on the 14th floor, and had the kind of view that reminded you how high up decisions could be made from. "It's going," he said. "Specific feedback?" "Your IT and physical security teams have never had a meeting together. They don't know each other's names. The threat that almost took your company down came through human relationships, internal trust exploited by external actors. And the 2 teams responsible for your security have been operating as if they work at different companies." She absorbed this. "What else?" "Your badge system logs entries and exits, but nobody reviews the logs. It's theater. The data exists, but it doesn't become information. What does that mean practically? It means Howard Briggs was in this building for 7 months having conversations nobody tracked because nobody was looking at who was meeting with whom in what configuration." He paused. "It also means I can fix that." She leaned back in her chair. "What do you need?" "Time. And the authority to run cross-functional meetings without having to justify them to department heads who didn't ask for them. You have both. And I need to talk to you about something else. Something separate from the security work." She looked at him. "Your employees," he said. "The ones below director level. I've been talking to people this week and there's something I'm seeing that I didn't expect to see." "Tell me." "A lot of them are exhausted in a way that isn't just workload. It's the kind of tired that comes from not having reliable structure outside of work. Single parents running on no margin. Veterans who came back and ended up in jobs that don't use what they have, but pay enough that they can't leave." He stopped. He hadn't meant to get into this today. He'd been thinking about it for a week, and it had come out anyway. That's not a security problem, but it's a stability problem. People under that kind of pressure make different decisions than people who aren't. Evelyn was very still. "I'm not saying that's how Conrad got to Briggs and Lennox," Mason said. "I don't think it was. But I'm saying there's a version of internal vulnerability that doesn't look like corruption. It looks like a person who needed something and found it in the wrong place because the right place wasn't available. She was quiet for a long moment. How many people are we talking about? She said. I'd need to look properly, but from 1 week of informal conversation, more than you'd want it to be. The look on Evelyn's face was complicated. It moved through several things: the processing look, the weight of something new, something that connected to other things she'd been carrying, and settled into the specific expression of a person who has just found a problem that also contains a direction. Okay, she said. Okay, like you're thinking about it, or okay, like I'm going to look at what we can actually do about it, she said. And I'd want your input on what we build, if we build something. It's not my area, Mason said. I can tell you what the problem is. I can't tell you how to build an HR program. No, she said. But you can tell me what would have helped you. He looked at her. When you came back, she said. When you were starting over. What would have actually helped? Not the platitudes. Not the thank you for your service. What practically, specifically, would have made the first 2 years different? He thought about it. He thought about the months after Kate died, when he was running on 3 hours of sleep and trying to figure out how to be a full-time parent in a world that wasn't designed for men to be full-time parents, especially men who'd spent a decade doing things that didn't translate into a resume any normal employer knew what to do with. He thought about childcare that cost more than he made. He thought about the specific humiliation of being overqualified for everything he was actually available for. I thought about how many times he'd sat in his truck in the parking lot of the grocery store just trying to find 15 minutes of quiet before going back in to be the only adult in a house with a 2-year-old. Flexible hours that didn't require explaining every time, he said. Childcare that was real, not theoretical. A manager who understood that being a parent wasn't a liability I needed to compensate for. He paused. Work that used what I actually had, not reduced to the parts that fit the job description, but actually used. Evelyn wrote something on the notepad on her desk. Not a lot. She wrote the way she talked, efficient and without ornamentation. What if it wasn't just an HR program, she said slowly. What if it was a formal initiative, structured employment and support designed specifically for veterans and single parents, real flexible scheduling, on-site childcare or subsidized childcare partnerships, career path development that accounts for non-traditional backgrounds. That's a significant undertaking. I know what significant undertakings look like, she said. I built a company from a one-room office and 2 people. A pause. Well, me and my partner, before he died. She said the last part quietly, without drama. I know what it takes. I'm asking whether it's worth taking. Mason looked at the view from the 14th floor. The city below doing what cities did. Moving, accumulating, the particular organized chaos of 100,000 separate decisions happening simultaneously. Yes, he said, it's worth it. Then let's build it. She looked at her notepad. I'm going to need your input on the veteran piece specifically. You know things about that transition that I don't. I'm not a policy person. You don't need to be. You need to tell me what's real. I have people who can turn real into policy. Over the following 6 weeks, Mason did 2 things simultaneously that he would not have predicted were compatible. He rebuilt the security infrastructure of a mid-sized technology company, and he helped design an employment program for people who looked like him 3 years ago. The security work was the more straightforward of the 2, which said something about how complicated the other one turned out to be. Building a cross-functional security team was a matter of authority, time, and clarity. He had all 3, and he used them without sentiment. Terrence turned out to be exactly as sharp as his 9 years of quiet observation suggested, and Mason gave him responsibilities that hadn't existed in the previous structure, and watched him take them with the specific satisfaction of a man who'd been waiting for someone to notice what he had. The employment initiative was harder because it required him to talk about things he hadn't talked about, to people he'd just met, in ways that would then become the foundation of a program that would affect real people. He and Evelyn had 4 more Thursday meetings, still at Gerald's coffee place, which had become genuinely theirs by this point, in the sense that Gerald now brought the coffee before they asked, and had started occasionally leaving a small plate of whatever he'd baked that week. And in those meetings, Mason said things he hadn't said out loud in years, about what it actually felt like to come home from a deployment and find that civilian life had a texture that nothing had prepared you for. About the specific way time moved differently when you weren't operating under mission structure. How the absence of clear objectives could be disorienting in a way that looked like laziness from the outside but felt like vertigo from the inside. About single parenthood and the compound exhaustion of it. Not just tired, but the kind of multi-directional tired where you were simultaneously the breadwinner and the caregiver and the emotional ballast for a small person who needed more than you felt capable of providing on any given day. Evelyn listened with the full attention she brought to things she'd decided mattered. She didn't offer sympathy in the performative way, didn't make the sounds people make to signal that they're tracking without actually tracking. She just listened and occasionally asked questions that told him she'd been listening. "Did you ever consider leaving Sadie with family while you figured things out?" she asked once. "Kate's parents offered," Mason said, repeatedly. "But you didn't." "No." She waited. "Because she was 2, he said. "Because I'd already lost Kate. Because the idea of Sadie waking up and looking for me and finding someone else instead—" He stopped. "No, it wasn't an option I could actually take." "So you built everything around that constraint. You build around what's real." She wrote something. He looked at the window. "That's the sentence," she said. "What is?" "You build around what's real. That's what the program needs to say, at its core. Not, we support work-life balance. Not, we value family. You build around what's real." She looked up. "Because what these people need isn't to be told they're valued. They know how much they're valued. What they need is for the structure to actually match the reality of their lives, not the version of their lives that's convenient for an employer." Mason looked at her. "You're good at that." "What?" "Taking the rough version of something and finding the form it was trying to be." She held his gaze for a moment. "I've had practice. My partner used to say I was the one who understood what things needed to become. He was the one who believed in the becoming." A pause that had something careful in it. "I'm still working on combining both." Gerald refilled their coffee without breaking stride past the table. Outside, the city had shifted into the particular gear of late afternoon on a Thursday. The light lower, the sidewalks more purposeful, people heading toward things rather than from them. "There's something else," Mason said. "Tell me." "The program. If we build it the way we've been talking about it, if it's real, not just something that looks good in an annual report, I want to run it." Evelyn set down her mug. "Not instead of the security work," he said. "In addition to it. They're related. They come from the same understanding of how people work and what makes them reliable or unreliable. I can do both if the structure is right." "That's a significant amount of responsibility," she said. "I know what significant looks like," he said. He said it without irony, but she caught it anyway, and one side of her mouth moved. "One condition," she said. "Go ahead." 3 o'clock stays non-negotiable. 3 o'clock is always non-negotiable. "Then yes," she said. "You run it." They formalized the arrangement in a meeting with HR and legal the following week, and Mason sat through 2 hours of documentation and policy language with the particular patience of a man who understood that the paperwork was the contract, and the contract was what protected people when goodwill wasn't enough. He signed where he was told to sign and asked 3 questions that the HR director hadn't been asked before and that required a follow-up memo to answer properly. On the afternoon the agreement was finalized, he picked Sadie up at 3 o'clock from school, because it was always 3 o'clock, because that was always where the day was anchored, and drove her home through the same streets he'd driven 100 times, past the same landmarks that had accumulated the small meanings of repetition, the pharmacy where they always ran out of her preferred Band-Aid brand, the park where she'd learned to ride a bike and fallen off 4 times before getting it, the corner store where the owner knew to put the orange juice behind the counter because Mason bought it every week and he liked not having to look for it. "How was school?" he said. "We did fractions," Sadie said. "They're not that bad once you know what they're actually doing." "What are they actually doing?" "Describing pieces of whole things." She looked out the window. "Like how most things are pieces of something bigger." He drove. "Dad," he said after a while. "Yeah." "Are you happy with the new job?" He thought about that honestly. About Terrence and the security team, who were becoming something worth being. About the program he was going to build. About Thursday mornings on the Kellerman site and Thursday afternoons at Gerald's coffee place, and how different those 2 versions of Thursday felt. "I think I'm getting there," he said. Sadie appeared to accept this as an adequate and accurate answer, which it was, and went back to looking out the window at the streets of a city that was the same as it had always been. And also, in some ways he was still mapping, different. He made a left on Caldwell and then a right on their street and pulled into the driveway of the house that had been just a place to sleep, and now, over years of small decisions, had become something more than that. He turned off the engine. The radio cut out. The afternoon settled around them, thin and quiet, the way late November afternoons did. "Fractions," he said. "Fractions," Sadie confirmed. "Pieces of whole things." "Most things are." He sat with that for a moment. Then he got out of the truck, and she got out of the truck, and they went inside because it was 3:30 on a Thursday, and dinner wasn't going to make itself, and Mrs. Kowalski was coming over at 6, which meant he needed to hide the good cards before she arrived. Conrad Voss was indicted on 7 counts in early December. Mason read about it on his phone in the parking lot of Sadie's school, waiting for the 3 o'clock bell, the way he read most things that mattered, in a quiet moment between the things that actually structured his days. The charges included criminal coercion, conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal use of electronic jamming equipment, and 3 counts related to the financial documentation recovered from his phone. Breck and Decker had taken plea arrangements that required their testimony against Conrad and against the 2 Belmore Capital executives who'd been running the acquisition strategy from above Conrad's level, people whose names Mason hadn't heard until the indictment, and who turned out to be significantly more important than Conrad in the actual architecture of what had been planned. Howard Briggs and Patricia Lennox had been referred to a separate federal investigation that was, according to the news report, expected to take the better part of a year to resolve. Briggs had retained a lawyer within 48 hours of being removed from the board and had not made a public statement. Lennox had made one statement, brief and lawyered to smoothness, that said nothing and communicated everything about a person who had already decided that cooperation was their best option. The school bell rang. Mason put his phone in his pocket. Sadie came out in the second wave, which was where she always was. Not first out the door, not last, somewhere in the considered middle of things, taking the time to say goodbye to whoever she'd been talking to, because she was, and had always been, a person who completed conversations before starting new ones. She had her backpack on one shoulder and a piece of construction paper in her hand that turned out, when Mason examined it in the car, to be a map of her imaginary country, the one with the Q name and the volcanic archipelago, which her teacher had apparently displayed on the classroom wall for 2 weeks and was now being brought home for the permanent archive. "She said it showed creative geographic thinking," Sadie reported. "Mrs. Peterson said that?" "In those words." "I like Mrs. Peterson. She also said the mountain ranges didn't follow tectonic logic." Sadie looked at the map critically. "I told her the tectonic situation on Kuvara is unique." "What did she say to that?" "She said she'd accept it if I wrote a paragraph explaining the unique tectonic situation." A pause. "I'm going to need some help with the paragraph. I don't know anything about fictional tectonics." "You know how to make things sound convincing," Sadie said. "That's basically the same." He almost said something about that being a concerning definition of geology, but she was already looking out the window with the satisfied expression of someone who had solved a problem, so he let it go. The Conrad news settled into him over the following days without the drama he might have expected. He'd been in situations before where the resolution of something, the formal, legal, documented resolution, landed with less impact than the thing itself. The alley had been the real end of it. Conrad in handcuffs in a federal building was paperwork, important paperwork, the kind that protected Evelyn and protected the company and put a line under something that needed a line under it, but paperwork nonetheless. Mason noted it, and then he went back to the things that were actually in front of him. What was in front of him in the first week of December was the first meeting of the joint security team, physical and IT together, in the same room, at the same table, for the first time in the company's history. He'd scheduled it for 7:30 in the morning on a Wednesday because he'd learned in his first month at Carrington Tech that Wednesday mornings before 8 were the one-time slot that nobody had managed to colonize with other meetings, and he wanted the room undisturbed. There were 9 people at the table, Terrence on the physical side, with the 3 rotating guards whose names were Danny, Sokoloff, and a woman named Reyes who had a background in private security and a way of assessing rooms that Mason recognized and respected. On the IT side, two security specialists named Huang and Martinson, who'd come in with the defensive posture of people who'd been siloed long enough to become territorial about the silo. And then two department liaisons that Evelyn had added at Mason's request, people from operations and HR who would carry what happened in this room back to their departments rather than letting it stay in security's orbit. Mason stood at the head of the table. He did not have a presentation. He had a legal pad with 6 lines on it. "I'm going to start with something I want everyone in this room to understand," he said. "The thing that almost destroyed this company did not come through a network vulnerability or an unlocked door. It came through a conference room. It came through handshakes and meetings, and people who had been trusted with access because trust had been extended without a framework for evaluating whether the trust was warranted." He looked around the table. "That's what we're building. A framework, not rules. Rules without understanding are just procedures that people find workarounds for. A way of thinking about what security actually means in a place like this." Martinson, the older of the two IT specialists, had the look of a man waiting to find out whether this was going to be useful or a waste of his morning. He'd been in tech security for 16 years and had the specific skepticism of someone who'd sat through too many initiatives launched by people who didn't understand what the work actually was. "What's your background?" Martinson asked. "Direct, not disrespectful." "Military," Mason said. "Naval Special Warfare, 11 years. And then? And then a construction site for 2 years, and then this." Martinson held his gaze. "That's an unusual path to corporate security." "Yes," Mason agreed, "which is why I'm not going to run this like a corporate security team. I'm going to run it like a team." He paused. "Which means I need to know what you know, not what's in your job description, what you actually know, what you've been seeing that nobody's asked you about, where the gaps are that you've been filing away because nobody wanted to hear about them." He looked at Martinson specifically. "What have you been seeing that nobody wanted to hear about?" A brief silence. Martinson looked at Huang. Some kind of wordless exchange that had the quality of two people checking whether it was safe to say the real thing. Martinson put both hands on the table. "The internal access logs for the 6 months before Briggs and Lennox were removed show 14 instances of after-hours document access from board-level credentials that don't match the documented meeting or work patterns for those individuals. I flagged it to the previous security head 8 months ago. He said board members have broad access by design and to let it go." The room was quiet. "That stays in this room for now," Mason said. "But I want everything you have on it. I want to understand the pattern." He looked at Reyes. "And I want physical access logs cross-referenced against those digital ones. What was happening in the building during those 14 instances?" Reyes had already opened her notebook. "I can have that in 3 days," she said. "2 is better," Mason said. "But 3 is fine." The meeting ran 80 minutes and produced, by the end, something Mason hadn't expected to get in the first session. A genuine conversation between people who'd been in adjacent rooms for years and had never been asked to think together. Hung at information that connected to things Danny had observed during night rounds. Sokolov had noticed a pattern in visitor badge usage that, placed next to Martinson's access logs, suggested a method of coordinating external and internal contact that had apparently been running for months without triggering any single alarm because it was designed to stay below every individual threshold. Nobody had been incompetent. They'd all been doing their jobs. They just hadn't been doing them together, which meant the thing that needed to be seen could only be seen from the angle where all the information combined, and that angle had never existed before. Mason looked at the 9 people at the table and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing being built correctly from the foundation. "Same time in 2 weeks," he said. "Bring what you find." He was in his office, a small room off the main security hub, with a window that looked into the building's interior rather than outside, which he'd chosen specifically because it meant he could see the floor rather than the sky. When Evelyn knocked on the open door at 11:15. "The indictment," she said. "I saw it this morning." She came in and sat in the chair across from his desk. She looked like someone who had processed news by doing 6 other things first and was now arriving at the actual feeling of it. 7 counts, she said. That's a serious number. His lawyers will negotiate it down. She said it without bitterness, just acknowledgement. That's how this works. He won't see the inside of a prison for the full weight of what he tried to do. I've been told to expect that and to be realistic. Are you? I'm trying to be. She looked at the window. What I keep coming back to is the company, not the legal outcome. The company. A pause. 18 months of their plan was already in motion when that lunch happened. If they'd gotten me into that SUV, if they'd gotten the signature, she stopped. I don't spend a lot of time in the what if, but this one I can't entirely close the door on. Because it was close, Mason said. It was very close. He didn't offer a reassurance he didn't mean. It had been close. The what if was real, and she was entitled to the weight of it. You know what actually stopped it? He said. She looked at him. Not me, specifically, he said. What stopped it was that you'd already been building a case in your head for 18 months. You had the context, the timeline, the names. When Okafor sat down with you in that alley, you gave her everything she needed in 20 minutes. If you'd been anyone else, if you'd been someone who hadn't been paying attention that carefully, Conrad's lawyers might have had enough room to reframe it as a business dispute gone sideways. He paused. You'd been watching them. You just didn't know how much you were watching until it mattered. Evelyn held that for a moment. I thought I was just being paranoid, she said. There's a version of paranoid that's indistinguishable from appropriate attention, Mason said. The difference is whether the things you're watching for are actually there. She almost smiled. Is that something they taught you? No, that's something I figured out the hard way. She stood. At the door, she paused. The program launches Thursday, she said. The formal announcement to the company. A pause. I'd like you to say something, not a speech, just something real, from your perspective. Evelyn. You don't have to, but people are going to understand it better coming from you than from me. I can explain the structure. I can explain the intention, but I can't explain what it feels like to need it. He looked at her. Thursday, he said. Thursday, she confirmed, and left. He sat with that for a while. The program, they'd named it the Carrington Bridge Initiative, which was Evelyn's instinct for language applied to the thing they'd built, was launching with 19 initial positions restructured to accommodate flexible scheduling, a partnership with 2 childcare providers within 4 miles of the building, a veteran-specific career development track that Mason had designed himself with the input of 3 people on the current staff who'd transitioned from military service and had opinions about what that transition actually required, and a mentorship component that paired new hires from non-traditional backgrounds with senior staff who had been briefed on why non-traditional backgrounds were not deficits requiring correction. It wasn't perfect. It had the roughness of something real, compromises made because ideal and operational were not always compatible, components that would need adjustment once they met actual people in actual circumstances, language in the materials that Mason had fought to simplify and that had been partially lawyered back into complexity by HR's documentation requirements. It was a thing that would need tending, that would break in some places and need fixing, that would work differently than anyone expected and require everyone involved to stay flexible and honest about what was happening versus what they'd planned. He was okay with that. He'd never trusted things that arrived without roughness. Thursday came with the particular quality of early December mornings in the city, cold that had stopped being a novelty and become a fact, pale light that did its best and didn't quite make it all the way to warm. Mason wore a jacket he'd owned for 6 years that had a small tear at the left cuff he kept meaning to address and never did, and he stood in the main conference room on the 5th floor in front of approximately 60 people and said what Evelyn had asked him to say. He didn't write anything down first. I left the military when my daughter was 2 years old, he said. Not because I wanted to leave, because she needed a parent, and I was the one who was still there. He looked at the room, a cross-section of the company, different ages, different backgrounds, different versions of having gotten to where they were. The next 2 years were the hardest of my life, not because single parenthood is impossible, because the world is not built for people who are trying to do 2 full-time jobs simultaneously. And when the world isn't built for you, you spend an enormous amount of energy just maintaining, just staying in place, not growing, not using what you have, just surviving the week. The room was quiet in the way rooms get quiet when something true is being said. I was lucky, he said. I landed somewhere that gave me a second chance at using what I had. Not everyone does. Some people spend years, good people, capable people People with skills and experience and the kind of judgment you can't teach in a classroom, grinding themselves down in situations that were never designed to accommodate the reality of their actual lives. He paused. This program isn't charity. I want to be clear about that because I think the word charity does damage to things that don't deserve it. This is a company deciding that talent comes from unexpected places, and that the structures required to access that talent need to match the reality of people's lives, not the other way around. He stopped. That's what I have. He sat down. Evelyn, standing to his left, said, "Thank you, Mason." And the room responded in the way rooms respond when the thing said in them has landed where it was meant to land. Not applause exactly, not immediately, but the particular shift in atmosphere that happens when a group of people has collectively recognized something. The applications came in before the end of the week. Not a flood. A steady stream of people inside the company who had been quietly managing circumstances they'd never mentioned because mentioning them had never seemed like something the company wanted to hear. Single parents, veterans, people who'd been excellent at their jobs while running parallel lives of exhausting complexity that nobody in a management position had ever fully understood. They filled out the forms with the careful thoroughness of people who'd learned to document everything, because everything had always required documentation to be believed. Mason reviewed them all personally. Not because it was technically his job. The program had its own intake coordinator, a woman named Sandra, who had grown up in a military family and approached every application with the combination of rigor and compassion that the process required. But he reviewed them because he'd built this, and he needed to know if it was doing what it was supposed to do. Most of it was. Some of it wasn't, and he fixed what he could fix and flagged what required a longer conversation, and the thing moved forward with the particular unglamorous momentum of something that was working in the way real things work, imperfectly, honestly, with constant small adjustments that nobody would ever think to put in a press release. The legal proceedings around Conrad moved with the slower momentum of the legal system, which is to say they moved in the way glaciers move, visibly, inevitably, and at a pace that required enormous patience from everyone waiting for them to arrive somewhere. Mason received subpoenas for 2 depositions, both of which he gave in rooms that smelled like recycled air and paperwork, with lawyers asking versions of the same questions they'd asked before in different configurations. He answered everything directly and without elaboration, and both depositions were, as far as he could tell, completely unremarkable additions to a record that was already well documented. Evelyn attended the first deposition herself, not because she was required to, but because she wanted to be there. She sat in the back of the room and said nothing, and afterward they walked 4 blocks to a diner that neither of them had been to before, and ate lunch at a window table while the city moved outside in the particular purposeful way of a Tuesday at noon. "How did it feel?" she asked. "Like talking," he said, which is mostly what it was. "Do you think he'll take a deal?" "His lawyers will make him. They always do when the evidence is what this evidence is." She pushed her food around for a moment. She'd ordered a grilled cheese, which he found unexpectedly human and also understandable given the morning. He'd ordered the same. "I keep thinking about Briggs," she said. "Not Lennox. Lennox I can place her, in my understanding of people. Briggs I can't." She looked out the window. 6 years. 6 years. He gave me good advice 6 years. Not all of it. Not the last year, maybe, but before that. Genuinely good advice that I followed, and that helped the company. How do you go from that to... She stopped. "You don't want an answer," Mason said. She looked at him. "You want to understand it," he said. "Those are different things. Understanding it would mean finding the thing in him that made it make sense. But I don't think it makes sense. I think some people tell themselves a story about what they're owed, and the story becomes big enough to justify almost anything, and it happens so gradually that by the time they're doing the thing, they've forgotten the person they were when they would have been horrified by it." Evelyn was quiet. "That's either a more or less forgiving reading than I expected from you," she said. "It's not forgiveness," he said. "It's just what I think happened." She looked at her food. "I hired him because he reminded me of my partner. In the early days. The way he talked about what the company could become. A pause that had something undefended in it. I think I was looking for something that was gone, and I found someone who knew how to look like it." "That's not a character flaw," Mason said. "That's grief working in the only direction it knows how to work." She looked at him for a moment that stretched a beat longer than their usual moments. "Where did you get that?" she said. From being a person for a while, he said. It accumulates. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something less categorizable. She picked up her grilled cheese. Mason, she said. Yeah. I'm glad you stood up in that restaurant. I know, he said. So am I. He meant it differently than she probably understood it. He was glad he'd stood up because Evelyn was sitting in a diner in December eating a grilled cheese instead of wherever Conrad's plan would have taken her. But he was also glad he'd stood up for the thing it had done to him. The door it had opened back to himself, the version of himself that had capabilities he'd been treating like a closed chapter. You didn't have to go back to what you were to use, what you'd learned from being it. That was the thing he was still figuring out how to say clearly, the thing the program was built on without it ever being stated directly. The version of himself that had gotten out of that truck at Harlan's with his daughter was not the Navy SEAL. It was not the construction electrician either. It was something that had been built from both of those. And from the 2 years of getting up every morning as the only parent in a house, and from Kate, and from Sadie pointing across a restaurant and saying that lady looks scared. You built something from all of it, or you built nothing at all. He finished his lunch. The diner had the good quality of not being in a hurry about anything. Sadie turned 8 in February, a fact she had been anticipating with the focused energy of someone who has decided that 8 is a meaningful threshold. She'd asked for 2 things for her birthday: a book about tectonic plates, for Kuvara research purposes, she specified, and for Evelyn to come to the small party that had been planned for Saturday afternoon. Mason had relayed this request with the specific awkwardness of a man who was not entirely sure how to categorize the request or what it indicated about his daughter's understanding of his life. Evelyn had said yes without hesitation. The party was 9 children and 4 adults, including Mrs. Kowalski, who arrived with a card game Mason had never seen before and whose rules she appeared to be inventing as she went. Evelyn arrived with the Tectonic Plates book and a second book about volcanic islands that she'd apparently researched specifically, which Sadie received with the reverence of someone receiving an important document. Mason watched Evelyn navigate a room full of 8-year-olds with the same quality of attention she brought to board meetings: genuine, present, not performed. She listened to a 20-minute explanation of Kuvara's complete political history from Sadie with what appeared to be actual interest. She lost to Mrs. Kowalski at the card game twice, which Mrs. Kowalski accepted with great satisfaction. At some point in the afternoon, Mason found himself at the kitchen counter, cutting cake while through the doorway he could see Evelyn on the living room floor, surrounded by children, holding the Tectonic Plates book open, while Sadie pointed at a diagram and explained something with great authority. He cut the cake and stood there for a moment. He was not a man who attached large meanings to small moments. He'd seen too much to romanticize the ordinary. But he understood, standing at that counter, that his life had a shape now that it hadn't had a year ago. Not a simpler shape, not necessarily an easier one, but a fuller one. More vectors. More people in it. More mornings where the question of what he was doing with the day that was in front of him had an answer he hadn't had to manufacture. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, the whole thing. The years move the way years do when you are no longer just surviving them, with a texture, an accumulation of particulars, a record of things that happened and things that changed and things that stayed the same by choice rather than by default. The Bridge Initiative expanded in its second year to include 2 other companies in the city who reached out to Carrington Tech's HR team because they'd heard about what was being built and wanted to build something similar. Mason consulted on both of those expansions with the particular practicality of someone who'd learned which parts of the design were transferable and which parts required reinvention for each specific context. Terrence was promoted. Reyes moved into a training role she'd been prepared for without knowing she was being prepared for it. Martinson and Huang had lunch together on Thursdays now, which had started as a working meeting and gradually stopped requiring a stated agenda. Conrad was convicted on 5 of 7 counts in the spring of the second year, the remaining 2 having been the subject of the negotiated resolution that Evelyn had predicted. He was sentenced in a courtroom that Mason did not attend because there was nothing in a sentencing he needed to witness. The fact of it was enough. He read about it in 3 paragraphs on his phone in the parking lot of the grocery store, in the particular quiet of that space. And then he went inside and bought orange juice and the specific yogurt Sadie had recently decided was the only acceptable breakfast yogurt and a bag of the good coffee that was more expensive than the regular coffee, but which made a concrete improvement to the experience of 7 o'clock in the morning. Briggs and Lennox resolved their federal matter with the kind of legal settlement that was financially significant and publicly humiliating and involved neither prison time nor acknowledgement of wrongdoing in the specific language of the filing, which was its own commentary on how the world worked. Evelyn read about the resolution without visible surprise. She'd been realistic about it from the beginning. "Is that enough?" Mason asked her. They were at Gerald's, which was still theirs on Thursday afternoons, which was a thing neither of them had named as a thing, and which showed no signs of stopping. "It's what it is," she said. "The company is standing. The people who tried to take it are not in positions to try again. The legal system did what the legal system does, which is approximately justice in the general direction without perfect satisfaction for anyone." She held her mug. "I've decided that's okay. I've decided perfect satisfaction is the wrong thing to want from a legal process. You want accountability. You want the record to say what happened. You want the people involved to know that what they did had weight." A pause. "It had weight." "Yes," Mason said. "It did." Gerald came by, refilled them, left a plate of something he'd baked that week that turned out to be a kind of walnut cookie that was better than it looked, and which both of them ate more of than they'd planned to. "I've been thinking about something," Evelyn said. "Tell me." "The company is stable. The program is running. The security structure is better than it's ever been." She turned her mug in the thinking circle. "I've been asking myself what comes next. Not what the company needs, what I actually want next." He waited. "I want to expand the program beyond Carrington Tech," she said. "Not consulting, not advising other companies. A standalone foundation, properly funded, properly structured, with the mandate to bring what we've built to organizations that don't have the resources to build it themselves." She looked at him. "I want to know if you'd be involved in that." "What does involved mean?" "It means helping build it, in whatever capacity makes sense given everything else you're doing." A pause. "I know you're not going to walk away from the security work, and Sadie is still the anchor," he said. "Everything gets built around that." "I know," she said. "I'd build it around that." He looked at her. The specific way she said that, not around your constraint, but around that, like the thing itself had value rather than being an obstacle to accommodate. "Yes," he said. She nodded, not with relief. She hadn't seemed nervous asking, with the forward-leaning certainty of a person who'd already seen the shape of the thing and was ready to begin. Sadie was in 5th grade when Mason first told her the full story of what had happened at Harlan's. Not the version she'd been given, the simplified version of Dad helped someone, but the actual version. The men, the positioning, the alley, Conrad saying her name. All of it. He told her on a Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table, the same table where he'd told her about the new job 2 years earlier, because some conversations belonged at kitchen tables. She listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. She had her hands flat on the table. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "He mentioned me," she said. "That man, Conrad." "Yes." "To scare you." "Yes." She considered this with the careful seriousness of an 11-year-old processing something that required care. "Did it work?" "It made me angry," Mason said. "Which is different from scared, but it was the kind of angry that makes you think very clearly." Sadie looked at her hands. "Dad, when you stood up in the restaurant, before he said anything about me." She looked up. "Why did you stand up?" He thought about the answer he'd given Evelyn years ago in the diner, about Sadie pointing it out first. He thought about whether that was the whole truth or just the part of the truth that was easy to say. "Because I had the ability to," he said. "And having the ability to do something and watching someone need it done," he paused. "At some point that stops being a choice and starts being the only thing that makes sense." Sadie thought about this with the full weight of her consideration, which was considerable. "Okay," she said. "Okay? I mean, that makes sense to me," she said. "I just wanted to understand it." She unfolded her hands and reached for the glass of water she'd brought to the table and forgotten about. "Also, I'm glad you stood up. Obviously." "Obviously," he agreed. "And I think it was good that I told you she looked scared." "It was," he said. "That was important." She accepted this as her due without excessive satisfaction, which was the correct response. Can we have pizza tonight? Not the frozen kind. I can call De Palma's. The one with the weird hours? They're open till 9. Okay. She stood up from the table with the decisiveness of a person whose important business is concluded. I'm going to finish my homework. Also, Dad. Yeah. I think you should tell Evelyn she can call me Sadie instead of always saying your daughter. She said it without embarrassment or particular emphasis, just the plain statement of someone identifying an unnecessary formality. She knows me. It's a little weird that she's still formal about it. Mason looked at his daughter. I'll mention it, he said. She went back to her room. He sat at the kitchen table for a while in the quiet of the house, which was a comfortable quiet now. Not empty, not the quiet of someone who has been left, but the quiet of a life that had enough in it that the silences between things were just spaces, not absences. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did in late spring when it came through the kitchen window, at an angle that made everything look warmer than it was. He picked up his phone and called De Palma's. They were open. He ordered the large, which was always more than they needed and always exactly right. And then he sat in that good light and thought about the things that had accumulated into the shape of this life. The ones he'd chosen, and the ones he'd been handed, and the ones that had arrived as a consequence of a moment in a restaurant when a 7-year-old in a gray dress had looked across the room and said something true. People talk about turning points as if they're visible in real time. As if you know, when you're standing up from a table, that this is the thing everything else will hinge on. It almost never works that way. The hinge moments mostly look like ordinary moments, a decision that seems small, a choice between sitting down and standing up, a daughter's voice saying what you were already thinking. You don't know it's the hinge until you're past it, and you look back and see the line where one thing became another. Mason Rourke had been a man defined for years by what he'd walked away from. The uniform, the missions, the specific weight of that version of himself that he'd packed into a box after Kate died and tried not to open. What he'd learned, slowly and not always gracefully, was that walking away from something was not the same as leaving it behind. You carried it differently. You chose differently what it was for. The skills, the instincts, the way of reading a room, none of that stopped being his just because the context changed. The man who stood up in a restaurant was the same man who'd trained for a decade to be useful in impossible situations. He'd just spent 2 years in a faded gray shirt pretending otherwise. The pretending had been necessary for a while, and then it hadn't been. That was the thing nobody tells you about the way a life rebuilds itself after it falls apart. It doesn't rebuild into the same shape. It builds into something that uses the materials of what was and the materials of what happened and puts them together in a configuration you couldn't have drawn a blueprint for in advance. It's not better, exactly. It's not worse. It's what it is, which is the thing that was actually possible, which is almost always stranger and more specific and more yours than anything you would have designed on purpose. Sadie got her pizza. She ate 3 pieces and talked for 40 minutes about a school project involving ecosystems that Mason followed approximately 60% of, and Sadie didn't seem to notice or mind. And at some point during that ordinary evening, with the pizza box open on the table and his daughter's voice filling the kitchen, and the day settling into the particular comfortable dark of a spring night, Mason Rourke stopped thinking about what he'd lost and just lived in what was there. It was enough. It was in fact considerably more than enough. And that, the knowing it, the feeling it without qualification or asterisk, was the thing that had taken the longest to arrive. Not the job, not the program, not the legal resolution or the rebuilt company, or any of the measurable outcomes that anyone looking from the outside could point to and name. Just this. Just the table and the pizza and his daughter's voice and the life that had been built from the rubble of another one by a man who had stood up in a restaurant on an ordinary afternoon and decided that walking away was not an option. He stayed. That was the whole story. He stayed.